We are not here to debate, but to enforce.
Have you ever believed that creatures, part human, part beast, might still be hiding in the forests, watching us? In the late 1980s, deep in the wilderness of Southwest Oregon, a reclusive war veteran named Rhett Lawson made a chilling discovery. 3 small, injured beings, covered in fur, with eyes almost human, caught in steel traps near the Umpqua River. He saved them, he named them, and in return, the forest began to protect him. Here's the truth few dare to speak. For decades, a covert organization called WGI captured and experimented on these forest creatures, labeling them biological assets. The survivors didn't forget. They didn't forgive. But they watched. This story comes from Rhett's personal journal. He's the only known human to stand face to face with a full-grown Bigfoot and live because they chose to let him go. Stick with us, and you'll uncover why Bigfoot has never been caught, what Echo Station really was, and why it vanished from all maps and the silent ritual of gratitude, from a 10-foot-tall mother creature with golden eyes. Official reports from Douglas County confirm a mysterious armed incident in 1989. Years later, folklorist Lena Ford found Rhett's old cabin and a message carved into the wall. They protect those who protect them. So if the forest ever goes too quiet, don't be afraid. It may just mean they're listening. And before we dive in, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments so we can say a proper hello to our fellow watchers of the woods. The wind that morning wasn't gentle. It pushed like something alive, slipping through the cedar posts and pine skeletons of the western fence, humming low, whispering just enough to feel like a voice was in it. Rhett Lawson stood with one hand pressed against the warped wood, the other on the brim of his hat, squinting toward the trees that lined the edge of Umpqua Bend like quiet sentinels. The light was copper, almost bruised, leaking through the late autumn sky in fractured streaks. The fog sat thick across the hills, stubborn and wet, like breath that wouldn't leave the chest. His boots sank into the soft ground with every step as he moved along the old fence line, checking the damage after the windstorm that had rattled the boards all night. One post had given up entirely, toppled sideways like a drunk falling out of his chair. He knelt beside it, his fingers brushing the roots, listening again. He didn't believe in ghosts, but the air out here sometimes made a man second-guess what counted as real. That's when he heard it. Not a coyote, not a deer. Something else. It was the sound of struggle, strained and soft. A breath mixed with a child's whimper and something more guttural. A sound that shouldn't be in this forest. Rhett straightened slowly, eyes narrowing as he turned toward the trees. It came again, ragged and quick. And this time, closer. He crossed the clearing without thinking, heart climbing up into his throat. His rifle stayed slung across his back, but his hand hovered near it, out of habit more than intent. The trees thickened, limbs bending under the weight of fog, and then he saw them. 3 forms tangled low to the ground near a hunter's snare, blood dark against the mossy floor. He froze. Not wolves, not bears, not anything he'd seen before. They were small, bundled, covered in thick fur matted with blood and leaves. But it was their faces that stopped him cold. They were close to human, not quite, but enough that the back of his neck went hot. Their eyes, deep and rounded, stared straight into him, not with animal fear, but something older, more knowing. One of them let out a choked sound, not quite a cry, not quite a growl, and Rhett moved without thinking. The traps were crude but effective. Barbed wire curled around thin limbs, biting deep. Whoever set them hadn't meant to catch rabbits. He crouched low, ignoring the sting of cold mud seeping through his jeans, and spoke softly. Not words, just sounds, calm tones, nothing sudden. They didn't fight him. That's what rattled him most. He unhooked each wire, his hands shaking when the youngest one bled heavier. The fur at its ankle had turned black with dried blood. He tore a strip from his flannel, wrapped it tight, then reached into his pack for the wool army blanket he always carried in the back of the truck. He wrapped all three, one by one, careful and slow. They smelled like pine and copper. Their chests rose and fell in rhythm, like children exhausted after screaming. Rhett lifted them gently, two cradled in his arms, the third bundled across his shoulder, and made his way back through the trees, through the fence line, across the field. His breath clouded in the cold air, mixing with the fog that never lifted. He didn't see the shape at first. It stood at the edge of the woods, behind the last line of trees, unmoving. At first, he thought it was another tree, tall, dark, thicker than the rest. But it wasn't. It had shoulders, arms, a towering frame that pulsed against the early light. Eyes, he realized, were fixed on him. The thing didn't move. Not one step. Rhett held its gaze until he reached the barn, and even then, he didn't look back. The old barn groaned when he pushed open the door. He kicked aside the unused hay bales and cleared the corner by the furnace stove. The matches sparked on the first strike, and the flame flared bright before settling into a glow. He lit the oil lantern next, hung it low on a nail beside the beam. Its light was warm, gold, and trembling. He laid the creatures down gently on a wool blanket, placing them near the stove, but not too close. The small one, the one with the bandaged leg, whimpered once and then curled tighter. The largest of the three, its fur mottled with ash-gray streaks, opened its eyes and stared at him, unblinking. Rhett exhaled. He didn't speak. Not then. He just watched them. Sat on an overturned crate, elbows on knees, feeling something in his chest shift. Something he hadn't felt in years. A reason, maybe. Or a tether. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the boards of the barn and moaning through the slats. The trees swayed just enough to sound like they were talking to each other. That night, Rhett didn't sleep in the house. He stayed in the barn, poured a mug of coffee from his thermos, kept watch beside the lantern while the wind howled through the valley. He checked their bandages, refilled the water bowl, added more wood to the stove. Sometime before dawn, when the sky was still dark copper and the stars were hiding behind clouds, Rhett stepped outside for a moment. The air was sharp, heavy with moisture, and the fog hovered like a low ceiling. He walked the fence line again. Habit, maybe. That's when he saw it. There, resting carefully atop the center beam of the fence, not placed like by wind, but set, was a bundle of grass. Willow, braided and shaped into a small coil, as if woven by careful hands. It hadn't been there earlier. Not when he passed through with the wounded. He stared at it. The braid was tight. Intentional. A message he didn't yet know how to read. His breath caught as he looked back toward the forest, where the fog thickened and the wind stirred through the trees. It didn't sound wild this time. It sounded like it was waiting. It sounded like it was trying to say something. And somewhere in the stillness of that morning, Rhett Lawson felt something shift again. Not in the air, but in himself. Something fragile and old. He didn't speak. He just stood there, hand resting on the wooden post, eyes locked on the woods, listening to the wind, listening like it might remember him, like it might carry the sound of gratitude or warning, or both. And though he couldn't name it, couldn't explain it, he knew one thing as sure as he knew how to breathe. He was not alone. Not anymore. The rain didn't fall heavy that morning. It whispered, light and steady, against the old tin roof of the barn like the tapping of small, careful fingers. Outside, the trees dripped with it. The mud churned where deer had crossed in the night. The air held the wet hush of late November, that in-between stillness when the forest hasn't yet committed to winter. But fall is already gone. Inside the barn, the light was dim. The oil lantern cast long shadows across the wooden beams, flickering slightly with every draft that crept under the warped door. Rhett crouched beside the blanket where the three beings lay, the steam from their breath barely visible now in the warmth of the stove. The wool beneath them had soaked up the moisture from their fur. He'd changed it once already. He'd wrapped them again in old army issue and stitched together fresh straw bedding, soft as he could make it. They hadn't moved much through the night, but now, just past dawn, they were stirring. The largest one, the one with the gray-tipped fur, shifted first, head rising slowly, eyes half-lidded and watchful. The others followed, slower, more uncertain. They didn't cry out. They didn't panic. They just watched him, and he watched them back. He didn't know what they were. Not exactly. But every instinct in him screamed they weren't just animals. And yet, they weren't people either. Not in the way the world would recognize. He had no words for them. No label that fit. But he knew hunger when he saw it. He poured warm goat milk into a metal cup, mixed it with thin oatmeal and a touch of salt, then spooned a bit into a cracked camping bowl and pushed it gently toward them. The smallest one, cream-colored with a limp still in its leg, sniffed the air, then leaned forward slowly, cupping its long fingers around the bowl. It didn't lap like a dog. It didn't fumble like a raccoon. It scooped deliberately, brought the mixture to its mouth, and swallowed. Its eyes never left his. The others followed, and Rhett sat back on his heels, hands open on his thighs, not moving. That's how it went for hours. No words, no sudden moves, just a quiet truce between breathing things trying to understand each other. It wasn't until afternoon, when the rain had tapered off and the clouds started breaking apart, that he said anything aloud. He didn't expect them to respond. He just needed to speak. "I don't know what you are," he said, voice low, hoarse with sleep and cold air. "But I know you're not monsters." They blinked. One of them, the ash-gray one, tilted its head slightly. That was the first time Rhett noticed something more than awareness. Recognition. He leaned forward a little, pointed gently. "You," he murmured. "Micah." The creature blinked again. He turned to the copper-brown one, a little larger, broader across the shoulders. "You, Brecken?" And finally to the smallest, pale-furred, quietest one, who still shivered even near the stove. He whispered, "Fallow." He didn't know why those names came, but they felt right. Like naming a mountain or a river or the first horse you ever rode. Not ownership, just acknowledgement. Days passed that way. Quiet mornings, oatmeal and goat's milk, cleaning wounds, changing bandages, watching them move. They began to explore a little. The gray one, Micah, always watched him closest. It moved with caution but not fear, studying his routines like a mirror. Rhett began to talk to them like they could understand. Sometimes about nothing, sometimes about the war, about his dad, about the silence he carried inside for years like a second skin. They never spoke back, but they listened. He could feel that. Each day he swept the barn, kept the stove burning, and marked their progress like a nurse charting vitals. He watched how they touched each other, how they looked to Micah first before moving. Micah was older, smarter, not by years maybe, but in the way he moved. On the 5th day, Rhett stepped out after dusk to check the traps again. Not to catch, to dismantle. He followed the path near the west fence, the same one where he'd found them bleeding. The traps were crude, thick steel wire twisted around sharp bent nails, set low and hidden in the brush. They weren't built to snare deer or bear. These were meant for something that walked with care. He found one still intact, and beside it, a metal stake driven deep into the earth. He pulled it free with a grunt and turned it over in his hand. Something caught the light, faint, rusted, but there. WG. The letters were stamped just below the loop, half buried in corrosion. He stared at them. Wildlife Genomics Institute. He'd heard the name once. Long ago, back when he still wore the uniform. They were the shadow on the tail end of funding reports, the kind of name you skimmed past because you weren't supposed to ask. He took the stake and headed back, eyes scanning the trees. The woods were still, too still. By the time he reached the barn, night had fallen full. The rain had started again, just enough to turn the wind mean. He slid the bolt on the door and stepped inside. The lantern flickered. The three were curled together near the stove. Fallow nestled between the older two. Micah looked up when he entered, and Rhett set the stake down quietly on the crate. He didn't mention it. Didn't need to. Later, after he'd checked the fire and made sure they were asleep, he stepped outside again for air. The wind carried the faint scent of moss and smoke. The moon was high but hidden behind clouds, and the darkness pressed in like something breathing. That's when he saw the marks. 2 smudges on the outside wall of the barn, near the far beam where the wood had aged to silver. Not paint, not carved, drawn, with what looked like black ash. 2 oval shapes mirrored, like eyes, or leaves, or something older. He stared at them, and a chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with cold. He reached out, hesitated, then touched one of the marks. The lantern inside went out. He froze. Behind him, the wind rose. Not sharp, not loud, just long, like a breath. He turned slowly, eyes sweeping the field. Nothing moved, but the wind didn't stop. It whispered again. Not wild, not empty. It sounded like listening, like waiting. And Rhett stood there, in the doorway of the barn, his fingers still tingling with the touch of ash, the breath of the forest curling around him like a question. He didn't go back inside for a long time, and when he finally did, he kept the stake with him. Because something was coming, and it wasn't just the cold. The road leading into Lawson's land wasn't paved. It wasn't even gravel anymore. Just mud and red clay that gripped tires like hungry hands when the rain hit wrong. That morning, it had. The tracks from Rhett's truck were barely holding their shape, already softening under the weight of a fresh drizzle. The horizon was the color of bruised iron. The fields around the house lay quiet, soaked and slick. The fog pulled back just enough to show what needed showing. And down that winding road came a car that didn't belong. He saw it before he heard it. A silver sedan, government-looking but trying too hard not to be. It moved slow, deliberate, its tires chewing through the mud with too much ease. The man who stepped out wore gray from collar to boot, like he'd been poured out of the same cloud that hung overhead. Long wool coat, clean shoes, dark gloves. No hat, just combed-back hair and the kind of face that didn't belong to the woods. It belonged to boardrooms and glass elevators. He carried a leather-bound ledger, thick and smooth, like something too old to still be in use but too important to leave behind. Rhett stood on the porch. Didn't move, just waited. The man smiled, thin and practiced. "Mr. Lawson," he said like he already knew the answer. "Dr. Marlowe Finch. I represent the Wildlife Genomics Institute, WGI." Rhett didn't blink. "Don't recall inviting you." "You didn't." The man stepped closer, careful not to let his boots sink too deep. "I'll be brief. We're here under federal authorization to retrieve lost biological assets, specifically those that have strayed beyond their containment zone." Rhett stayed silent. "We believe you may have, perhaps unknowingly, encountered these specimens. I'd like to take a look at your property. With your permission, of course." "What kind of specimens?" Rhett asked, even though he already knew the answer. Dr. Finch opened the ledger. Not paper inside. Thin sheets, plastic-coated, with diagrams and lines of data Rhett couldn't read from the porch, but didn't need to. One page showed something that looked like a skull. Too narrow, too long. Not quite human. Not quite not. "I'll need a court order," Rhett said flat. Finch didn't stop smiling, but the eyes went colder. "Of course," he said, flipping the ledger shut. "We'll make the necessary arrangements." He left without raising his voice, without stepping past the gate. But when he drove away, the road behind him felt colder. That night, Rhett didn't sleep. He sat in the barn, back against the wall near the stove. The oil lamp burned low, the flame steady like it knew not to flicker. Micah stayed close. Fallow tucked into Bracken's side. Their breathing had synced up like clockwork. It was a rhythm Rhett had started to learn. Inhale, pause, exhale. No panic. Just watching, just surviving. The sound came close to midnight, not the wind, not the forest. Something human trying too hard not to be. A scuff against the barn's outer wall. A shift of gravel. Then metal on wood. Rhett stood quietly. Picked up the rifle he kept behind the crate. The bolt slid back with a soft clack. He moved slow toward the door. Didn't swing it wide, just cracked it enough to see the shadow on the other side. A figure. Masked. No jacket. Just black clothing, head to toe. One hand on the latch. The other held something small and metallic. It wasn't a weapon. Not yet. But Rhett saw the tranquilizer dart even before the figure raised it. Micah growled low. The sound didn't belong in the throat of something small. It vibrated through the floor. The masked man flinched. The lantern flickered once. Rhett stepped into the doorway. Rifle raised. Not to kill, but to warn. He fired into the ground beside the man's feet. The echo cracked like thunder. The man bolted, slipping in the mud, crashing into the fence with a hollow thud. Something flew from his pocket and landed with a soft clatter. Rhett didn't chase him. He watched the shadow disappear into the trees. Then he walked over to the object the man had dropped. A plastic badge, still laminated, still warm from the man's body. Wildlife Genomics Institute. Clearance Level 3, Facility Access B4, and on the back, faint but legible, embossed into the laminate, Batch 23A. Subject, Lawson Sr. His breath stuck in his chest. He read it again, and again, his father's name. Not first, not full, but close enough that the skin on the back of his neck prickled. The barn door creaked behind him. He turned. Deputy Ruth Salter stood there, flashlight angled low. Her truck had come up the back road, the one nobody used except folks who knew the land better than maps. "I heard the shot," she said, voice rough like gravel in warm hands. Neighbors called it in. Rhett didn't speak. She saw the badge. Took it without asking. Her thumb ran along the edge, slow. Her eyes didn't blink. "This ain't local," she said. "This is bigger." "I know." She stepped inside, looked at the stove, the scattered straw, the worn blankets. She didn't look at the shapes in the corner. Didn't ask. "I'll write it up quiet," she said. "No paperwork crosses state lines, not yet." He nodded. She hesitated, then lowered her voice even more. "Your name? Lawson. You sure you weren't in the WGI files? Back in the 70s, there were rumors, experimental lists, civilian contractors flagged for field exposure. My father was logistics, Army Corps of Engineers." She looked at him hard. "Might want to dig a little deeper than that." She left without another word. The night settled again. Rhett sat beside the crate, thumbed the edge of the badge. The words wouldn't stop echoing in his head. Batch 23A, subject, Lawson Sr. He looked across the barn to where Mika watched him. The eyes weren't wild. They weren't afraid. They were waiting. The ledger hadn't come for the creatures. Not really. It had come for the truth, and the truth was starting to move, like something buried too long finally waking up, and it was headed straight for him. The wind that morning came down hard from the Siskiyous, cold and fast, like it had somewhere it needed to be. Rhett drove with one hand on the wheel and the other gripping the folded journal he'd pulled from his father's old trunk. The pages were stiff, water-stained, filled with pencil entries, most of them nothing but supply tallies and field notes. But in the back, toward the spine, where the binding gave a little, were numbers he didn't recognize. Not military, not medical. Just handwritten dates beside strange notations. Echo Station, Batch 23. And on one line, a single word in darker pencil, pressed harder than the rest. Failures. He didn't know what made him drive to May Holloway's place that day. Maybe it was the weather. Maybe it was the badge in his pocket. or the way Mika had started staring longer at the window, like he knew something out there was shifting. Whatever it was, Rhett followed it. The truck rumbled along the muddy road like an old dog sniffing a trail it hadn't walked in years. May's cabin sat low by the Applegate River, half hidden behind a curtain of naked alder trees and old blackberry vines. The wood was silver gray, the kind of color that comes only from time and storms. A wood smoke thread climbed from the chimney, and the front porch creaked under Rhett's boots before he even knocked. May opened the door before he could. She was smaller than he remembered, thinner, but her eyes were the same, bright and stubborn, like they saw through everything. Her flannel sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and her hands smelled like spruce and something herbal. "I was wondering when you'd come knocking," she said, stepping aside. Rhett entered without a word, removing his hat like a boy visiting his grandmother. The house smelled like dried apples and firewood. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old books, labeled jars, and a few photographs so faded the faces had gone ghost pale. He didn't sit until she pointed at the worn chair by the stove. She sat across from him, knees close, a mug in her lap. He opened the journal, turned to the marked page, let it rest on the table between them. She looked at it for a long time without touching it. When she finally spoke, her voice was slow, worn with memory. "That belonged to your father. He was a logistician. That's what he told us." "He was more than that," she said. "And less. I found a WGI badge with his name, or something close." May didn't blink. She set her mug down carefully and stood, walked to a cabinet near the back wall, opened it with a key from around her neck. From inside, she pulled a canvas bag, old and faded, like it had once seen war and never left it. She laid it on the table, untied the cord. From it, she pulled a folded cloth. Inside, a hand-drawn map, black smudges where ink had bled through. No legend, no compass rose, just lines, streams, a red X where the forest thickened past the old mining trail. "Echo station," she said quietly. "They built it deep, off-grid. No records that lasted. Your father helped design the supply routes. They thought it'd be safe, buried in trees and snow and silence. What happened?" "They started with animals, then mutations, hybrid genomes, cross-species cognition. Not long after, they started testing on things that shouldn't have existed in the first place. Things they made, then labeled defective, then ordered destroyed." Rhett swallowed. "You were there." "I was a field nurse," she said. "Back then, I didn't know what I was patching up. The wounds were strange, the screams were worse. I saw one once, not a child, not a man, something in between. It looked at me like it had questions, like it understood the answer before I could lie." She sat back down, her shoulders small in the fading light. "There was a pair, young. They were supposed to be incinerated after testing showed instability. That's the word they used. Your father helped me get them out, told me he'd stage the explosion, that he'd die with the rest if it meant burying the program. He survived." May nodded once. "He survived, faked it, changed records, cut contact. You were maybe 10, 11? After that, he made sure WGI couldn't find him, until now." Rhett couldn't breathe right. The journal sat between them like a bomb that never went off. The map looked older by the minute. His hands felt like someone else's. "I have 3 of them," he said finally. "Young. They're not feral. They're listening." May smiled without warmth. "They know who helps and who doesn't." He looked at the map again. The trees. The red X. "Echo station." "I need to go," he said. "You will," she replied. "But not tonight." Before he left, May placed something else in his hand. A small stone, smooth and dark, carved with a single notch on one side. "They use these to mark, to communicate. If you see one with 3 notches, that means they're warning you." She walked with him to the porch. "If you hear the wind go quiet," she said softly, "don't be afraid. It means they're remembering." The road home felt longer. The fog had crept low again, hugging the fence line and the tops of the bare black trees. The barn glowed faintly ahead, the lantern flickering through the slats. He parked the truck, stepped down, boots sinking into the mud, and there it was. Braided willow grass, fresh, damp with river scent, tied gently along the fence, pointing toward the forest, a direction or an invitation. Rhett stood in the cold, his fingers still wrapped around the map in his coat pocket, the stone nestled against it like a weight. Somewhere behind him, inside the barn, he heard the soft shuffle of fur on straw, the kind of sound you don't notice until it stops. He didn't move. The wind paused, just for a breath, just long enough to make him feel like something had leaned close and whispered thanks. And then it was gone. But the invitation remained. So did the debt. And debts like these didn't stay buried for long. The snow had thinned by the time March rolled into Umpqua Bend. The cold wasn't gone, not fully, but it had softened. The kind of cold that melts from the inside out, leaving puddles in the fields and mist hanging low over the grass like breath waiting to exhale. The air was thick with that strange blend of rot and rebirth, the scent of old leaves pushed up by new green. Rhett had started leaving the barn doors open again during the day. The goats wandered a little farther. The creek behind the west fence ran louder with meltwater. The land felt restless. So did the young ones. They were stronger now. Bigger. Fallow had stopped limping altogether. Bracken had taken to stacking rocks outside the barn in odd spirals. Micah had begun disappearing for longer stretches, slipping beyond the field and returning with mud-streaked fur and pine needles in his hair. He said nothing, of course. None of them spoke. But Rhett didn't need words to feel the change. They were listening for something. That morning it came. It started as a sound. Barely there. A low call that rolled in from the tree line, deep and slow like wind through a hollow drum. Micah froze mid-step. His head turned sharply toward the trees, his shoulders stiff with attention. Fallow let out a whimper and moved closer to Bracken. Rhett put down the bucket in his hand. The sound came again, stronger. Micah stepped forward, raised his chin. Then he answered, not with a scream, not with panic, but a sound that came from somewhere deep in his chest, something layered with meaning Rhett could only feel. It echoed across the open field and hit the trees like a key in a lock. The forest moved. It didn't shake. It didn't roar. It simply parted. The tall firs along the edge bent ever so slightly, not from wind, but from weight. The branches shifted in slow procession, as though something massive was moving through them with purpose. Rhett stepped onto the porch. The sky was overcast, but the light hit the field in a dull gold that made everything look sharper. Micah stood still. Bracken dropped to one knee. Fallow lowered her head, and then she came. From between the trees, the shape formed slowly. Too tall to be anything he'd ever seen on two legs, too graceful to be mistaken for a bear. The figure stepped out of the forest and into the open, and the world seemed to fall silent. She stood nearly 10 feet tall, fur the color of burnt earth laced with deep red and bronze that caught the light with every slow step. Her body moved like something carved from muscle and memory. The hair on her head was matted with leaves and frost, her shoulders broad, her presence impossible to look away from. But it was her face that stopped Rhett cold. It wasn't human. But it wasn't anything else either. Her eyes were molten amber, large and wide-set, with a depth that spoke of generations. Her brow was heavy, but her mouth was soft, closed in a solemn line that held no threat. She walked on two legs, upright, steady. Her arms hung long and powerful. Her hands were massive, fingers thick and blunt, but expressive, every movement deliberate. Micah stepped forward. He walked across the field without a sound, stopped 3 feet from her, then raised his forehead to hers. She leaned down. Their heads touched, brow to brow, in silence. Her eyes closed. His did too. The air around them felt charged, like something sacred was being exchanged. Rhett didn't move. He couldn't. His chest burned. There was something about that touch, that moment, that pulled a thread inside him he didn't know was still there. It wasn't just reunion. It was something older. A ritual, a memory, a forgiveness. He felt like he was trespassing, just watching. Then everything snapped. From the woods, headlights cut through the fog. Harsh and blinding. A truck engine, tires tearing into wet ground. Rhett turned and ran. The WGI convoy hit the edge of the pasture fast. 2 vehicles, matte black, unmarked, antennas bristling. Doors flew open. Men in dark gear moved quick, rifles slung, vests strapped, masks up. Finch stepped out last. Same gray coat, same eyes. The ledger still in his hand, but this time he didn't bother pretending. "Target acquired," someone called over a comm. The matriarch turned slowly. Didn't run, didn't flinch. She stood in front of Micah, wide and still, her body shielding him entirely. A man raised a tranquilizer rifle. Before he could aim, she moved. She didn't sprint. She didn't scream. She lunged with a speed that shattered the illusion of weight. Her arm swept out, caught the man mid-shoulder, and flung him into the side of the truck like he weighed nothing. Metal groaned. The rifle clattered. The others scrambled, one dropping his dart gun in the mud. Finch shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the roar. Not hers. Rhett's ears rang. She let out a sound that didn't belong in any world he knew. It wasn't rage. It was warning. It was a mother telling the world, "You will not take what's mine." Rhett grabbed the flare gun from his workbench inside the barn. He fired it into the sky. Not to scare her, but to blind the others. The flare burst above them in red and white. The pasture turned crimson for a heartbeat. The matriarch reached down, grabbed Rhett by the front of his jacket, and pulled. They fell together, hard, into the ditch behind the pasture, just as another dart flew over his head and sank into the mud. The young ones vanished into the trees. The matriarch moved fast, faster than anything her size should move, dragging Rhett under cover, across the gully, up through the thicket. He could barely keep up. His shoulder burned, his lungs heaved. But she didn't let go. They stopped deep in the woods, far from the lights, far from the trucks. Rhett collapsed onto his knees. She stood over him, watching, not panting, not blinking, just watching. Then she turned, looked toward the field, then back at him. Her hand reached out, massive and warm, fingers stained with mud and blood. She didn't touch him. She placed her palm on a mossy stone beside him and pressed. Then she walked away. The forest swallowed her. He stayed on the ground, chest heaving, ears still ringing. The smell of pine and iron filled his nose. He looked down, carved into the rock, fresh, dark, were 4 words scratched in charcoal. They protect those who protect them. He stayed there until the wind shifted, until the night took its place again, until the sound of boots and engines faded. And when he returned to the barn, it was empty. No blankets, no straw, no soft breaths, just silence. But not the kind that meant it was over. The kind that meant something had changed. The forest looked different when you walked into it with a map in your coat and a name like Echo Station burning a hole through your thoughts. The silt-colored clouds above didn't break all morning, and the fog came in heavy as breath, curling between the black trunks like it belonged there. Rhett walked ahead, boots soaked, pack strapped tight, hand brushing the old revolver on his hip, even though he wasn't sure what it would do against what they might find. Behind him, May Holloway moved with quiet determination, her steps careful, slow, steady. Deputy Ruth Salter brought up the rear, her service pistol drawn but pointed to the ground, her eyes scanning everything, especially the trees. The trail was barely there, just a ghost path on the map, swallowed years ago by moss and fallen pine. But the markers still whispered if you knew how to listen. A broken limb here, a stretch of ground where nothing grew, a rusted nail jutting from a cedar trunk like a bone poking through skin. The wind didn't blow through this part of the forest. It hovered, pressed low. dense enough to make the woods feel like the inside of a forgotten mouth. Rhett stopped when they reached the rise. Just ahead, beyond the thicket, something man-made broke through the green. Concrete, faded and flaking, partially swallowed by vines and moss. The entrance sloped down like a bunker, the rusted metal doors still bolted shut. A symbol on the wall above them, a W enclosed in a circle, barely visible through decades of rain and rot. "This is it," May whispered. They pried the doors open with a crowbar. It took both Rhett and Ruth pushing together. The hinges groaned like something old waking from sleep. Inside, the air was stale and sharp, soaked in chemical dust and mold. The hallway beyond dropped into blackness. Rhett clicked on the flashlight. The beam carved out pieces of the dark one slice at a time. Peeling paint, exposed wires, shattered glass, the remains of something that used to be sterile. May led without hesitation. They passed metal doors with peeling labels. Lab B, Containment 2, Housing. Some hung open. Some stayed locked. The walls were stained, not with blood, but with time. Water damage, soot, strange burn patterns that crawled up corners like vines trying to escape. The further they went, the colder it got. A hallway to the left had collapsed. The floor sagged with mildew and blackened plastic. And then, at the end of the corridor, they found the heart of it. A chamber, half lit by skylight shafts broken open by roots. A cage stood in the middle. Steel bars, 12 feet high, rust curling at the base. The door hung open. Inside, the ground was scorched and pitted. Around the perimeter, shelving units still held vials of faded fluid. Some cracked, others sealed. The labels were gibberish. Batch IDs, date codes, sequences of letters and numbers that didn't belong to any known taxonomy. On the far wall, someone had spray-painted in faded red. "Echo remembers." May stepped to the center of the room and knelt beside the cage, running her hand along one of the lower bars. "This is where they kept the first pair," she said, "before they were deemed unstable." Ruth moved toward a file cabinet, half-rotted, drawers rusted shut. She pried one open with her baton. Inside, water-warped files stuck together like dead leaves. She flipped through carefully, pulling a few free. "These aren't lab reports," she muttered. "These are purchase logs, transfer orders, payment records." Rhett took one. At the bottom of the page, stamped in dark ink, "Lawson, R, Logistics Coordinator." He stepped back. "I thought he was just moving crates," he said quietly. "Materials, not—" "He didn't report everything," May replied. "He forged a few orders, made things disappear." "Was he a part of it?" "No," she said. "He tried to end it." She handed him a black binder, half-melted, spine warped. Inside, photographs clipped to reports. Not all were clear. Some were medical, X-rays of skulls that weren't quite human. Others were field notes, sketches, a few shaky Polaroids. One showed a burned facility, charred trees. A flare of orange caught mid-frame. Rhett turned the page, and there he was, his father, younger, in uniform, standing outside the entrance they'd just come through, holding a clipboard, smiling but not with pride, with resignation. The page beneath it was a typed letter. Only half remained, the bottom burned through, but he could read the first few lines. "To whom it may concern, if you're reading this, I failed to bury it deep enough. I only pray the ones we spared find peace." He closed the binder slowly. Then the floor trembled, just enough to shift dust from the ceiling. Ruth drew her weapon. May backed away from the cage. Rhett moved toward the hall, flashlight cutting through the dark. Footsteps. Too many. They came fast. Boots on metal, gear clinking, flashlight stuttering into view. "W guy." Finch's voice echoed before his body arrived. "You really are your father's son," he said, stepping into the chamber like he owned it. Behind him, 4 men, rifles ready, eyes cold. Ruth raised her gun. "Don't," she warned. "I'll put one through your leg." Finch smiled. "You won't shoot me, deputy. That would make you accountable. May didn't move. Her eyes stayed on the cages. Rhett scanned the room. The ceiling was low in spots. Exposed pipework. Overhead platforms. He saw it. A service ladder rusted to the wall, leading to a hatch near the ceiling, probably emergency ventilation. He nodded toward Ruth. She got it instantly. She moved first, fired a warning shot at the feet of one of the guards. Chaos bloomed. May hurled a vial. It exploded on the ground, sending up a cloud of chemical vapor. Finch shouted. Rhett ran, climbed the ladder. May followed. Ruth last. One of the guards fired. Bullets slammed into the ceiling just beneath the hatch. They pushed through, into the night. They stumbled into thick brush. Rain had started again. Soft but cold, soaking through coats and boots. Behind them, the chamber echoed with alarm. And then, silence. Not because the soldiers stopped moving, but because something else entered. From the tree line, tall and still, came the matriarch. She stepped into the clearing like she had every right. Her eyes found Finch. She didn't roar, didn't charge. She placed a hand on the bars of the cage, the same one May had touched. Her gaze never left his, and something in Finch, something small, finally cracked. He shouted for retreat, called for backup, but the wind rose before they could move. It wasn't howling, it was speaking. Rhett, watching from the tree line, heard it clearly for the first time. A voice in the wind. Not language, not sound. Judgment. He didn't move, didn't breathe, because Echo was still alive, and it remembered. By late June, the grass had turned gold across Umpqua Bend. The kind of gold that shimmered under heat waves rising off old fence posts. The kind that made a man slow down without knowing why. The war was over, or at least the part you could see. The part with gunmetal and trucks and flashlights cutting through trees. That part had gone quiet, at least for now, but the ground still remembered. The woods too, and so did Rhett. The barn sat empty most days. No small shapes curled in blankets. No soft shuffle of fur or strange, deliberate breathing in the dark. Just dust motes dancing in late light, and the occasional creak of wood remembering weight that was no longer there. He kept the door open anyway, like a habit he couldn't shake. Some mornings he still set out bowls near the stove. Water, a little oatmeal. He never found them empty, but he never saw who came. That summer, Ruth drove up often, never in uniform, never with questions. She brought coffee in thermoses and lists of names the public would never hear. Together, they went through what remained, documents, photographs, recordings so grainy they looked like ghosts moving through snow. None of it made the news. None of it ever would. But the people who mattered knew, and they moved fast. With May's testimony, Ruth's findings, and what Rhett pulled from Echo's dead heart, Judge Braddock signed the orders. A federal inquiry. Unsealed files. A slow dismantling of WGI that, if not total, was at least irreversible. The men who came for Micah wouldn't come again. Not like that. Not without answering for it. It didn't change everything, but it changed enough. That July, Rhett rebuilt the fence, not to keep things out, but to let them through. He left the southern line open and marked it with cedar posts, stripped of bark and carved with 3 notches each. He called it the corridor. Others might have called it something more official, more scientific. He didn't. He just walked it each morning, boots trailing lines in the dew, eyes scanning the woods for shapes he missed. And one day they returned. It was a Sunday. Sky clear. The air so still you could hear insects brushing wings against tall grass. Rhett was mending a section of wire that had sagged after a week of dry heat. The radio in the shed buzzed faintly with an old bluegrass song. He felt it before he saw it. A silence falling, not heavy, not warning, just respectful. He turned, and there they were. Micah stood in the tall grass beyond the cedar posts, a half step ahead of bracken and fallow. They were bigger now, shoulders broader, movements quieter. Not wild, but not children either. Between them walked the matriarch. Her fur shimmered with copper light. Darker now, her eyes deeper. She moved slow, each step measured, like a hymn being sung without words. Rhett didn't speak. He dropped the pliers in his hand and stepped forward. The air around them felt warm, not from the sun, but from something older, something shared. The matriarch stopped 3 feet from him, and she raised her hand. Not fast, not threatening, just open. Rhett nodded, then placed his own palm against hers. It wasn't a handshake. It wasn't surrender. It was acknowledgement. He felt the heat of her skin through the fur, the weight behind it. Her eyes searched his face, not with suspicion, not with fear, but with something close to grief. Then she lowered her arm and stepped aside. Micah moved forward, stopped in front of Rhett, and smiled. Not with teeth, not like people do, but in the eyes, in the angle of the head, in the stillness. They stood that way for a while, neither pushing forward, neither stepping back. Then the matriarch turned, leading the others into the woods again, vanishing like mist curling off a river at sunrise. That night, Rhett sat by the fence as the sun went down. He'd brought out the old army box again, the one with his father's journal, the badge, the pieces that used to confuse him. Now they felt lighter. Not meaningless, but finally understood. He pulled out a letter May had given him weeks ago. She'd found it in her shed, tucked into an envelope yellowed with age. The handwriting was sharp, familiar. It was from his father. "Son, I know I won't get to explain everything. I chose silence. Not because I didn't care, but because I wanted you to live free of it, free of the weight. But you found it anyway. So now I'll say this. Some things are made, some things are found, but the ones worth protecting are those we're lucky enough to recognize when they look back at us. You saw them. You stayed. Thank you for becoming the man I wasn't allowed to be." Rhett folded the letter slowly. The stars were out now, the sky deep in purple, the kind that makes you feel like the world might actually be listening. He looked up. Somewhere in the distance, the faintest sound, like branches brushing against stone, reached his ears. He stood, walked back to the fence, and there it was, another braid of willow grass, still damp, pointing toward the river, toward safety, toward departure. He smiled, not because it was over, but because it meant they'd survived. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the old army coat hanger he'd carried since the war, bent, rusted, a little piece of something that used to hold up weight that no longer needed holding. He walked to the riverbank in the dark, past the goats sleeping under the lean-to, past the sycamores swaying in the breeze, and without ceremony, he let it fall. The hanger hit the water with a soft splash. It drifted, not fast, not far, but it was enough. He stood there for a long time, and for the first time in decades, he didn't feel like a soldier. He felt like a keeper, of a promise, of a crossing, of a quiet covenant written not in ink or orders, but in breath and memory, and 3 shapes standing in a field full of sunlight. And somewhere, from deep in the woods, a voice not made of sound moved with the trees and said, "We remember." The roof of the old house had turned the color of moss. The chimney sagged like a tired shoulder, and the porch steps creaked beneath even the weight of falling leaves. Autumn had come early that year, slipping down from the Siskiyous with a hush that settled in the bones of the valley. The fog, always thicker near the bend, rolled slow and silver through the tall grass, curling around the fence posts Rhett had once mended by hand. The board still held, though the wire rusted a little more each season. No one had lived there in years, but people still came. They came quiet, alone. Most didn't knock. Lena Ford parked at the base of the old road, just past the creek where cattails bowed in the breeze. Her boots crunched through dead leaves as she walked up the trail, one hand clutching a leather satchel, the other wrapped around a mug of gas station coffee. She wasn't young anymore, but there was something sharp behind her eyes. A lifetime spent chasing forgotten stories had taught her how to listen in silence, how to find truth in places where truth didn't leave a name. The porch boards groaned when she stepped onto them. A crow lifted from the chimney, cawed once, then vanished into the fog. Inside, the house was still. Dust coated the floor like soft snow. Sunlight filtered through warped window panes, slicing gold lines through the gloom. She moved with care. Not reverence, exactly, but respect. She found the journal in a drawer beside the hearth, wrapped in oilcloth, tied shut with fishing line. Rhett's name was written on the first page in thick pencil. Not fancy, just enough. She sat by the window, laid it across her lap, and began to read. The first entries were rough. Notes on fence repairs, goat feed, memories of frost-bitten mornings and the taste of burnt coffee. Then came drawings, lines etched in graphite of footprints too wide for any boot, of hands with 5 fingers but the wrong proportions, of eyes. Always the eyes. She flipped further in. The tone changed. He wrote of silence like it was a language, of wind patterns that didn't match weather reports, of breathing in the trees at night that didn't belong to deer or bear. He wrote about sounds that weren't animal but weren't human either, about the moment fear turned to understanding. And then he wrote of them, not as monsters, as people. In one entry, short and clean, he wrote, "They watched me long before I saw them." Another, scribbled at the edge of a page like an afterthought, read, "If you hear the forest go quiet, don't run. It means they're listening." Lena closed the journal softly. The air inside the cabin had a weight to it, like the walls remembered what had been said within them. She stood and crossed to the window. Out past the barn, past the fields gone wild, the woods rose like a wall, but not cold, not ominous, just waiting. Locals had stories, of course, they always did. Some spoke of strange lights on the ridge, others of footprints found after storms. A few swore they'd seen shadows move where shadows shouldn't. The most persistent tale, though, was the one about the firelight. They said sometimes, on still nights, you could see the glow of flames dancing in the clearing near the old pasture. And if you looked long enough, you might see them. Figures. 4 of them. Towering. Motionless. Standing just at the edge of the tree line, watching. No one ever got close. No one wanted to. Lena stepped onto the porch. The air had warmed with the morning. Down near the base of the trail, the river whispered over stones, its voice steady, patient. She reached into her bag, pulled out a recorder, clicked it on. "My name is Lena Ford," she said softly. "Folklorist, researcher. I'm standing at the property line of the Lawson homestead in Umpqua Bend. Locals refer to this place as the Keeper's Field." She paused. Let the breeze move through the trees. "I've spoken to 34 residents so far. All recall stories tied to this land. None agree on the details, but every single one ends their version the same way, with silence, with the feeling that something lives in the woods not to harm, but to witness." She lowered the recorder. Somewhere to her left, wind brushed through the pine needles like fingers on a drumhead. Low, measured, intentional. Before heading back to the truck, she stopped by the fence. The boards had been painted once. The color long gone, now worn gray like the spine of an old mule. She traced her hand along the top rail. Something caught her eye. On the ground, near the last post before the path curved toward the river, were marks. Fresh. 3 lines, drawn in black. Maybe charcoal. Maybe something else. Arcing slightly like a bird's foot pressed into dust. But there were no birds that big in these parts. She crouched, touched the lines lightly. The marks didn't smudge. They were dry, recently made, still sharp. They pointed inward, toward the woods. She stood, looked to the trees. The wind dropped again, not silence, but presence. Lena smiled, not because she understood everything, but because she didn't have to. She turned back toward the trail, her boots brushing pine needles and river stones. The journal clutched tight beneath her arm. The field behind her softened under the weight of sunlight, the house leaning just a little more with the day's warmth. And in that field, the breeze picked up once more, just enough to stir the wind chimes Rhett had carved from hollow cedar and twine. They swung slow. They didn't jingle like metal. They hummed, low and wooden. One long note that moved through the house, the porch, the pasture. One long note that lingered, as if something had been said, or remembered, or both. And then the wind passed, and Umpqua Bend folded itself into quiet again, not empty, just listening, always listening. Sometimes the most powerful truths don't shout. They live in the quiet spaces between footsteps, in the hush of the woods just before dusk, in the breath you didn't know you were holding until something bigger than you lets it go. There are stories that don't need names anymore because they've moved past the need to be explained. They're felt, etched into the grain of old wood, in the fog that never fully leaves the valley, in the silence that lingers long after the last word is spoken. At its heart, this was never a story about monsters or myths. It was a story about what we choose to protect and why. About the invisible threads between us, strangers, creatures, memories that stretch across time and loss and fear, and hold anyway. It was about listening before judging, about seeing with more than just your eyes, about how compassion, even in the smallest gesture, can echo louder and longer than fear ever will. We live in a world that moves fast, too fast to notice the soft things. But sometimes, in the slowing down, in the returning to places forgotten or left behind, we find pieces of ourselves we didn't know were missing. Not every mystery is meant to be solved. Some are meant to be respected. Some doors are left open not because we expect anyone to walk through them, but because the act of keeping them open means we haven't given up on hope. There's something deeply human in the idea that understanding doesn't always come with proof. That belief doesn't always require explanation. Sometimes it's enough to know we're not alone. Not in our pain, not in our wonder, not in our desire to do right by the things this world doesn't fully understand. Because maybe the point isn't to conquer the unknown. Maybe the point is to live alongside it, with humility, with grace, and with the willingness to protect what cannot speak for itself. Thank you for walking with us through the fog, the stillness, and the silence. If this story moved you, made you feel something you didn't expect, or reminded you of the quiet power in kindness, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know what stayed with you. And if you believe these stories matter, stories of heart, of wilderness, of wonder, consider subscribing and joining us for the next journey. Because out here, beneath the trees and beyond the noise, there are still stories waiting to be heard. And together, we'll keep listening.